All right, let's get right into it. Today we're tackling a really tough but incredibly important topic, the hidden biases that are at work inside the family court system. We're going to explore how things like race, class, and disability can unfairly decide the future of a family and, crucially, what we can do about it.
So let's start with what our source material calls a taboo truth. And honestly, this just sets the stage perfectly. The system is totally set up to handle individual complaints, right? You can talk about your specific case. But what happens when you try to say the system itself is the problem? Well, that's a conversation that gets shut down really fast.
And that's the key idea here. We're not talking about one bad judge or a single caseworker having a bad day. We're looking at a much bigger problem, one that's literally built into the structure, the rules, and the day-to-day processes of the system itself.
This slide just lays out the difference so clearly. On the left, that's what most people think of, the one bad apple theory. But what we're actually digging into is on the right, structural discrimination. These are the policies, the practices, the things that look neutral on paper, but in reality end up creating unfair outcomes for the same groups of people over and over again.
So let's just nail down this definition. Structural discrimination isn't about some obvious mustache-twirling villain. It's about systems that seem totally fair on the surface, but in practice create these huge disadvantages for specific groups of parents.
Now, this idea is absolutely crucial. It's called intersectionality. And it's not just about race, plus being poor, plus having a disability, like you're just stacking bricks on top of each other. No, it's about how these things combine and interact to create a completely unique situation, a whole new category of risk. It's less like addition and more like a chemical reaction. It creates something entirely new and far more dangerous.
Okay, so we've got the core ideas down. Now let's see how this stuff actually plays out in the real world. We're going to look at how these three faces of bias, race, class, and disability, really show up in practice.
First up, race. And honestly, the data here is just impossible to ignore. This chart, which is based on research in our source, shows that Black and Native families are dramatically overrepresented at every single step of this process, from the first report all the way to losing their parental rights. And the source is crystal clear. This is not because there's more abuse in these communities. It's because of things like bias and who gets reported and how professionals judge risk.
And this slide gets right to the how. Just look at the different language used. The exact same behaviors get described in completely different ways. A white parent under stress, they're seen as overwhelmed and needing support. But a parent of color showing that same emotion, they're much more likely to be called aggressive or dangerous. That's implicit bias right there in black and white.
Next up is class bias. And this slide, well, it says it all, doesn't it? Poverty does not equal neglect. But inside the court system, those two things are confused all the time. Not having money for a bigger apartment or fancy after-school programs is a symptom of poverty, not a sign of bad parenting, yet it's so often treated as neglect. And this leads us straight to something our source calls paywall justice. Imagine this. A court orders a parent they have to complete all these services to get their kid back. But those services have huge price tags. If you can't afford the therapy or the evaluation, the system doesn't see a financial problem. It sees a non-compliant parent, and that failure is then used as evidence against you.
And the third face of this is disability. The system is just filled with these incredibly harmful stereotypes. Judgments get made based on a diagnosis on a piece of paper, not on a person's actual ability to be a great parent. These are just assumptions, They're rooted in fear and misinformation, not evidence.
So, we've seen the biases in action. Now let's decode the secret language they use. Because this kind of discrimination loves to hide in plain sight, disguised as neutral, professional jargon.
See, bias isn't just a single event. It's a process. It seeps into the system at every single one of these critical points. From the moment someone decides to call a hotline, to how an evaluator writes their report, all the way down to how a judge perceives a parent's credibility when they're on the stand, every step is a place where bias can sneak in. Now this slide is basically a translation tool. Let's call it the bias decoder. When you see a report that says a parent is non-compliant, you have to ask, what does that really mean? Does it mean they're defiant, or does it mean they couldn't afford the bus fare to get to the class they were ordered to take? When it says they lack insight, is that true, or is it just a neurodivergent person who disagrees with a flawed evaluation? Learning to translate this language is everything.
Okay, let's get even more practical. We're going to run through a quick-fire list of red flags. Think of this as your early warning system for when bias might be creeping into a case. First up, if you see reports that focus way too much on the quality of someone's neighborhood or the size of their home, that is a massive red flag. This is almost always coded language that lets judgments based on class and race get into the official record.
Red flag number 2. A court orders a whole long list of services but gives zero thought to the cost or transportation or insurance. This is a classic setup. It sets a parent up to fail, which, you guessed it, leads right back to that non-compliant label we just decoded.
This one is so critical, especially for neurodivergent parents. If evaluators are describing things like odd affect, poor eye contact, or rigid thinking as if they're character flaws, you need to be on high alert. These are often just common traits of autism or ADHD that are being totally misunderstood and weaponized.
And red flag number 4, when a parent, especially a parent of color, shows completely normal emotions, like frustration or fear in the middle of a nightmare situation, and they get described as angry or volatile. This is a common way racial bias takes a natural human reaction and twists it into a perceived threat.
So we've identified the problems, we've spotted the red flags. Now what? What can actually be done about all this? Let's turn to a roadmap for change, with real strategies for both families and the professionals who work inside this system.
For parents, the source suggests 4 key actions. 1. Document everything. Create a detailed timeline. 2. Know your rights, especially under laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. 3. Make formal written requests for any accommodations you need to participate fairly. And 4, you have to actively challenge that biased, coded language wherever you see it.
And look, change has to come from the inside, too. For the lawyers, judges, and social workers, this means building actual bias checks into their everyday work. It means tracking data to see where the disparities are, and it means being the person in the room brave enough to question that coded language and demand real evidence.
And this really brings us to the core argument of this whole explainer. This quote from our source material just says it all. In way too many cases, parents are not losing their children because they're bad parents. They're losing because their race, their income, or their disability is being used as a substitute, a proxy, for the word unfit.
So that's our look into the unseen scales of bias in the family court system. We've gone from defining the problem to spotting the red flags and exploring how to fight back. And it all leaves us with one last crucial question. Now that you can spot the patterns, what are you going to do to challenge them? Thanks for tuning in.